I'm less worried about sort of lethal autonomous weapons. And I find what's most scary are intelligent computers that can simulate compassion.
The Profile with Premier Christianity magazine.
Hello and welcome to The Profile, here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Megan Cornwell. The Profile is the show where we sit down with a well-known Christian to hear more about their life, faith and ministry. It's brought to you in an association with the UK's leading Christian publication, Premier Christianity magazine. The monthly title features more interviews just like this, as well as all the latest news, reviews and columnists. Plus, there's great new content uploaded daily to our website. To get access wherever you are in the world, head over to premierchristianity.com/subscribe. Joining us on the show today is Dr. John Wyatt. John is Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Paediatrics, Ethics and Perinatology at University College London, and also a Senior Researcher at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He spent 25 years working as a paediatrician, specialising in the care of newborn babies in intensive care. Now retired from frontline duty, John is focusing on the ethical, philosophical and theological issues raised by rapidly advancing technology. Dr. John Wyatt, welcome to the show.
Hi, that all sounded a bit of a mouthful, but
it gives us lots to talk about. But let's start at the beginning, John. On the show, we like to ask all of our guests about their faith journey. So tell us about how you became a Christian.
Yes, I was brought up in a Christian home by very clearly committed Christian parents up in the north of England. But I think I always struggled as an adolescent and about the relevance of Christianity to. I was very interested in science and I felt slightly brainwashed by my parents, and it was not really until I left home and went to university that for the first time I had a sort of period to try and work out what I really believed, and in particular whether it was possible to be a Christian and at the same time be really interested in science and technology and research and so on. And at that time I was studying physics, and it was quite a struggle over those first few weeks and months. But I do remember one or two very significant occasions when, as I was wrestling and talking to other people and so on, I increasingly became aware of that Jesus was not just a theoretical idea, a historical figure, but actually was a living person. And it was really at that time that I traced the origins of when Christianity came alive to me. And then quite soon after that, much to my surprise, there was an increasing conviction that I should change from physics and train to be a doctor, and that part of my calling was to serve Christ as a doctor. And I suppose the way I sort of rationalized it was that in the end, what God was most concerned about was people, and that medicine was a way of using the science that I was good at for the people that God really cared about.
Wow, so that must have come at quite left field then. So you're at university studying physics, and presumably you're a year, 2 years into your degree?
I'm just about a year into the degree, and I went to my tutor, and he was quite appalled, I think, when I said that I wanted to change. And it particularly meant that I had to give up a place. I was actually at Oxford University at the time. I'd had to give up a place at Oxford because it wasn't possible to stay on and study and to change to medicine there. I'd have to go away and reapply and all the rest. So by a whole series of coincidences and things which at the time seemed very much to be God's leading, the possibility opened up to have a place here in London at St Thomas's University Medical School, and so I moved to London and started training as a doctor. Although I have to say, the first few months I started to wonder, have I just made the most terrible mistake of my life? Because the comparison between the dreaming spires of Oxford and the sort of grime of South London and Lambeth was quite painful.
I can imagine Oxford is a lovely city. I'm sure you must have got quite a lot of strange looks from family and friends as well when you tried to explain that God was leading you to London to change degrees.
Yes, and looking back, it was quite an extraordinary thing to do in a way. And yet at the time, and one of the, I think, the lessons which many people have found is that when we're a young Christian, it almost seems as though God just writes things so clearly. There were so many coincidences and chances and things that happened that it just seemed blindingly obvious that this was the right thing to do. And now looking back, I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed at Oxford, and I think my life would have gone forward in a very different way. So looking back, I can definitely see God's hand on my life.
Mm. And you went on to then work in paediatrics, and you ended up in a very senior role in the end, didn't you, in the hospital? Tell us a bit about that time and what that job was like, because it wasn't without its challenges, was it?
Yeah, that's right. So a little bit more in the story before getting there is that because I was in London, I started going to All Souls Church in the centre of London, and there I came under the extraordinary influence of John Stott, who was the rector of All Souls. And to begin with, he was just this rather austere, distant figure in the pulpit, and I was this guy sitting on the back row and writing down, because I was very impressed by his sermons and so on. And then, to my utter surprise, I got this message: "Would you like to come and have a cup of coffee with me in the rectory?" And it was a bit like being invited to see the headmaster. And I was terrified, thinking of, what had I been guilty of? Some terrible heresy or something that the headmaster had asked to see me. And to my utter astonishment, he wanted to be friends, and he said, I understand you're studying medicine, and how can I pray for you, and what books are you reading at the moment? And he built up a friendship which actually lasted for more than 40 years, all the way until he eventually passed away and is just about at the age of 90. And he had a huge influence on my life. That friendship, I think, in many ways transformed everything that I was doing, and it was really he who sort of just confirmed this vision of trying to be a Christian in the professional world of medicine, and being and engaging. He was very keen on what he called double listening, that we were called not only to listen to the Bible and to what God was saying in the church and in the Bible, but we also had to listen to what the world's problems, what the world's questions and issues were, and we needed to build a bridge between these two worlds. So when I then went into and studying medicine, initially I trained in adult medicine as an intensive care doctor, and then in general internal medicine. It was only after several years that I then started doing some pediatrics. But I remember the first time I went on a pediatric ward round, and the consultant got down on his hands and knees in order to look at one of the new toys that the children was playing with. And I really thought, I've arrived. This is where I belong. And then going on to the baby intensive care unit, again, it was just almost like a feeling of coming home, that this is where I belonged. And so I did feel very drawn to pediatrics, partly because I love children, and partly because it was a very rapidly developing area of medical research, and I became fascinated by the problems of ensuring that babies survived, even those who were very small or very sick, and giving them the best chance of survival.
I guess a role like that, you're really at the forefront of seeing wonderful things when babies pull through, and you're able to revive, a child that looks like they're kind of near death. But then equally, I'd imagine you've also had to tell parents absolutely terrible news, the worst news you can ever receive as a parent. So tell me a bit about how you negotiated those really difficult extremes in your role.
Yes, that's absolutely right. It's an extraordinary kind of work where you do go between these most wonderful things about seeing a baby surviving and being clawed back from death and then doing incredibly well, and you learn to see how extraordinarily resilient and tough babies are. In fact, physiologically and medically speaking, babies are much tougher than adults, and the sort of things that would kill any of us stone dead, actually this little baby comes back fighting and comes back from the brink. So there were some wonderful things, and one of the extraordinary things is that we were not only caring for big babies born at full term, but some incredibly tiny premature babies, including babies right at the limits of viability, who literally weighing about a pound in weight and fitting into the palm of my hand. And I remember I just started working at the baby unit, and an extremely premature baby at 24 weeks was being delivered, and I had to go up and be ready there to resuscitate this tiny little baby. And I remember running down. In those days, it was quite sort of crude. This was back in the 1970s, not just early 1980s, and the resuscitation, the place where the baby was born, was just one floor above, and I literally ran down the back stairs carrying the baby in my arms and straight into the incubator where they were all waiting to take this baby. And the baby literally was cupped in my hands, and that baby did remarkably well. That was the first tiny baby I'd ever seen, and that baby did remarkably well. And 16 years later, visiting the neonatal unit was this very punky looking young lady with a stud in her nose which was that baby, and sort of meeting her again and remembering how tiny she was, just an extraordinary experience. So there were wonderful things, but also, as you say, terrible things, and having to tell parents that their baby had severe brain damage or was dying was really very challenging. Although I also sort of had an instinct that actually caring for dying babies and allowing babies to die well and supporting parents through this whole process actually was something that was incredibly important, and that we shouldn't see it as a terrible failure, that there was we couldn't make every baby better, but we could help every baby to die being at peace and pain-free and being cuddled by the parents and supported. And so that was also an enormous privilege. And and looking back now, after having done it for more than 25 years, I must have cared over that time for probably many thousands of babies, and yet the ones that stick out in my mind, nearly all of them are babies who died, as being a very special moment of sharing a moment of grief and yet tenderness with parents.
How did your faith play a part in those kind of moments?
Yes, well, again, it was something that it seemed to be very important, that not just for those crisis moments, but really for the whole of everyday work, that I was trying as much as possible to be aware of God's presence and to be working in a prayerful way. And I discovered that it was perfectly possible to be actually praying internally at the same time as talking to parents, or to be examining an abdomen or discussing a case. And so, although very often, I don't want to sound like some kind of super spiritual person, it was, very often I failed in that, but nonetheless, there was a sense that actually God was there. One of the things that I've learned is that the presence of God can be just as much in an intensive care unit or a hospital ward as it can be in a beautiful church. And yes, sometimes it was possible to share faith and And sometimes it was just something that was internally. I was praying and just trying to be. The way I thought of it is that in these tragic moments, we're just called to be the hands of Jesus. I can't necessarily be the lips of Jesus. I can't say anything, but I can be there, and I can try and show the love of Jesus in the way I respond, in the way I treat the baby, in the way I treat the parents. And that is just an extraordinary privilege. And, as I look back on those special moments, I think, yes, it was painful. Yes, there were tears, but it was also an extraordinary privilege to be part of it.
Mm. John, did you ever feel that your faith was compromised in any moments at work, whether that was because things were so busy that you felt you couldn't devote the time that you wanted to special cases, or because there was a dilemma where you felt, one thing should be done, but other doctors felt something else should be done, and you felt compromised in that? Were there any situations like that you came across?
Yes, I think that the honest truth is that there are a number of many times quite difficult things where you know that you're being confronted with challenging, difficult problems. Certainly when you're a junior doctor, you're not in a position to make decisions, and you just have to, in the end, follow the decisions that the senior doctors are making. And sometimes, I felt deeply uncomfortable about some of the decisions and felt I wouldn't have made that decision. But as a junior doctor, you have to try to be faithful in what you're doing, whilst recognizing the limitations and the challenges. And there are all kinds of challenges, and increasingly, although I went into pediatrics and into the care of newborn babies because I love children and because it was a very rewarding kind of medicine, increasingly I realized I was in the midst of some kind of ethical quagmire or maelstrom of all kinds of ethical challenges going on. And I knew that God had called me to be there, and that I had to try and engage with some of these ethical challenges. So, as the technology advanced, we were getting better and better at keeping babies alive. And the question was, should you ever say enough is enough? And how do you decide when to do that? And is it ever right to switch off the life support machinery? And what happens if we can predict that a baby is going to have very severe brain damage? How do we decide what kind of treatment, or whether it's ever right to withdraw life support treatment? So those are agonizing questions, and I really wrestled with trying to think it through, both as a doctor but also as a Christian. What was the right way to think about this? And then one of the really strange and difficult issues is that in the very same hospital where we were caring for some tiny little vulnerable babies born at 24 weeks or even earlier, one floor up in the same hospital is the fetal medicine unit, where on a regular basis abortions are being carried out because of an abnormality of the baby. The unborn baby has been found, and because of the way the law works in the UK, it's actually legal for abortions to be carried out beyond 24 weeks of gestation, even in quite mature babies. And so later on, when I was a consultant, quite often I was being called up to leave the neonatal unit, where we were struggling to save for a whole series of tiny little babies, to go one floor up to the fetal medicine unit to talk to a mother who's considering having an abortion because of some problem with her baby. And the baby in her womb is considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than some of the babies which we're struggling to save one floor down. And then you're trying to get your head round this really strange and troubling situation, and asking, how do I respond in this situation, and what are my responsibilities?
Mm.
And
What did you
and there
feel?
isn't
What
an
did you
easy
feel
answer.
God's speaking to you about in those times, John? How did God help you deal with some of those tricky discussions?
Well, I mean, the conclusion I came to was that, and this is a sort of a more general principle for when we're working as Christians in a kind of secular situation, is to make the difference between what our desires are, what we would long to happen as individuals, and what our responsibilities are as professionals. And it's important that we keep these things different. We keep these things separate. They're both important, but they're not the same thing. So when I went to talk to a woman who was considering having an abortion because of a problem with her baby, my desire, it would be that she would find the courage and the love to be able to care for her baby and continue the pregnancy, even if that meant the child was going to be severely disabled, because I genuinely believe that that is the best thing for the baby and it's the best thing for the mother. But I can't make that happen. So my duties, my responsibilities as a doctor is to treat her with respect, with compassion, with understanding and empathy, to try to give her honest, accurate information, to help us see what the implications would be, how we would be able to care for the baby if she continued with the pregnancy, and so on. And I feel if I've done that and done it well, then I fulfilled my responsibility. And even if then subsequently the mother decides to go ahead and have an abortion, I feel sad, but I don't feel guilty. Because ultimately I fulfilled the responsibility that I can have within this National Health Service where I'm working. And but I do know that actually a number of women who, following the conversation, actually did decide to continue the pregnancy, and so I suppose at a human level, I'm actually responsible for the fact that a number of babies were born with quite significant disabilities and problems. But I remain, having seen that and actually having cared for babies who then died after birth, I remain absolutely convinced that however painful and strange that seems, it's actually a better way to allow the pregnancy to continue and for the mother to meet her baby after birth and to be able to care for the baby, even if it means that the baby then dies after a few days or weeks or whatever.
That's interesting, because that's one of the big arguments, isn't it, about, for abortion up until very late in the pregnancy, that, the trauma of the baby dying, etc., or having severe disabilities. But actually it seems to me that you're saying that in fact the mental health of the woman is improved by going through the process and having that opportunity to say goodbye, I guess.
Yes, I mean, it sounds paradoxical. If you've never been in that situation, it would seem so obvious that in that terrible situation, doing an abortion kind of solves the problem. But the terrible truth is it doesn't solve the problem. But what the difference in the experience is that if somebody has had an abortion in these tragic circumstances, even if it's quite late in the pregnancy, the natural instincts are to try to keep everything quiet. It's not something you want to broadcast. It's not something you want to tell everybody. And quite often people will keep it quite private. And if someone said, "Well, that's strange because you were pregnant, last month and you're not pregnant now. What happened?" And they answer, "Well, I can't talk about it. Please, let's change the subject." It's a kind of something which often the instinct is to try and keep it quiet. Whereas once a baby is born, even if that baby only lives for minutes or hours, it becomes a kind of public phenomenon, so everybody knows, the extended family come along, there are photographs, there are footprints taken, there's maybe some kind of memorial or celebration service, or baptism is carried out. Family, friends, the grandparents come, other people know. And so, yes, there's terrible sadness and loss, but it's done in the context of a very social and supportive environment. And of course, that carries on. So, cards come and memories and so there's a whole supportive environment around the parents. And having witnessed that so many times, yes, it's painful, but it just seems to me a better way.
You spent 25 years in this role, but you did move out of medicine, didn't you? You moved into a more of a sort of research role. Tell me a bit about what led you to leave frontline medicine.
Yes, it was. I was under extraordinary pressure because not only was I became the most senior consultant, as on the unit, and my special areas of interest was 1, brain damage in babies, and 2, ethical problems and challenges. And so I accumulated some of the most desperately difficult cases and challenges, and I was trying to be the rock and trying to be holding it all together. And at the same time, I was leading a big international research project where we were doing a clinical trial, testing out and developing a new treatment for babies who'd been at risk of brain damage at birth. And so I was aware that I was under enormous strain, and then I started having some real stress and mental health difficulties, and it was like a wake-up call that I realized that I couldn't carry on indefinitely in this role. And so I moved sideways away from the clinical frontline and was concentrating much more on ethical issues and writing and teaching about ethics, and also some of the academic and research issues. And to be honest, that was a bit of a relief. Having done it for 25 years, I had a sort of strong feeling that I needed to pass this on to other people. It was taking so much of a toll on my own physical and mental health.
I'm Megan Cornwell, and you're listening to The Profile on Premier Christian Radio. My guest is Dr. John Wyatt, who is also the host of a brand new podcast from Premier, Matters of Life and Death. This podcast delves into issues around healthcare, ethics, technology, science and faith, and it provides helpful advice for Christians wanting to engage with the big questions of life, death and everything in between. We'll be back with more from John right after this.
Do you feel inner conflict between truth and lies, the way of Christianity and the way of the world? If so, it's time to live no lies. With huge spiritual insight, New York Times bestseller John Mark Comer guides us into recognizing and resisting the lies that rob us of peace and freedom. Live No Lies. Yours free when you take out an annual subscription to Premier Christianity magazine. Subscribe at premierchristianity.com.
The Profile with Premier Christianity magazine.
Welcome back to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Megan Cornwell. I'm speaking to John Wyatt, a Christian doctor and co-host of a brand new Premier podcast called Matters of Life and Death. In part 2 of this interview, Dr. Wyatt explains how his pioneering research helped many newborn babies thrive, and why Christians should take robotics and artificial intelligence more seriously.
So actually, it was mainly for babies born at term, but who then suffered birth problems at birth. So it's about 1 in 1,000 or 2 in 1,000 births where a baby everything's been going fine, and then catastrophe strikes, often in labour, and the baby gets stuck, or there's a problem with the placenta, or the womb can actually rupture. And in this situation, the baby is exposed to very, very severe oxygen deprivation, and that can either lead to death or to survival with very severe problems. And so we were seeing babies like this on a regular basis, sometimes born in our own hospital, often born in other hospitals, but then referred after birth to us. And it was tragic to see this wonderful big baby who's done so well for 9 months, and then catastrophe has struck. And following up these children in the outpatient clinic, often it was very, very tragic to see them. Often these children were in severe damage, in a wheelchair, with severe cerebral palsy, often with blindness and with epilepsy and with learning difficulties. And the whole life and the life of the family had been damaged. And I was part of a research team who was trying to understand what was going on in the brain in these particular cases. And what we've shown is that, much to our surprise, when the brain got short of oxygen, it used to be thought that when the brain was short of oxygen, the damage happens instantaneously. There was nothing that could be done. And much to our surprise, what was emerging from our research and from research of some other people around the world was that actually the damage didn't happen instantaneously. A lot of the damage happened over the following 48 hours after the baby was resuscitated after birth. And that what seemed to happen was the shortage of oxygen triggered off a whole cascade of damaging chemical reactions in the brain, and that was what was doing the damage. So I was then part of some experiments to try to see, could we reproduce this in the laboratory, and could we work out how to stop these damaging reactions. And we tried various different things, and I was very interested in the possibility that cooling the brain might actually switch off some of these damaging reactions. And there have always been cases of babies born outdoors who got incredibly cold, sometimes trapped in snowdrifts, and astonishingly, they've done very, very well. And I've actually was involved in 2 cases where babies after birth got extremely cold, and we thought they would be damaged, and to our utter astonishment, they survived and did extremely well. And so we showed that actually just reducing the brain temperature by 3 or 4 degrees seemed to be very powerful in switching off the damaging reactions. And so the question is, would we dare to do this in a baby? Because what all the textbooks said is that the most important thing as a baby is you had to keep them warm.
I know, I remember when mine were born and they were saying, oh, she's a little bit cold, quick, get the blankets, put up the radio, turn up the heat.
Absolutely. And we've been going on, paediatricians have been banging on at this for decades. And the textbook said, if babies get cold, all these terrible things happen. And the buildup of acid in the bloodstream, and the blood clotting goes haywire, and the bowel is damaged, and the lungs don't work properly. And so we were really wrestling with this. And yet, on the other hand, the cooling seemed to be quite good for the brain, but it might be very bad for the rest of the body. So in the end, we developed the idea of a cooling cap, which we would put on the baby's head to try and reduce the brain temperature, while we would try and keep the rest of the body as warm as possible. And so I was then part of an international trial where we did some pilot studies, which the babies did very well, and then we had to do one of these clinical trials. And so, of course, in the pandemic, we're now all much better informed about clinical trials, but and about a randomized trial. And so that we did a randomized trial. We had to have 230 babies, all at risk of severe brain damage, and we were going to take half of them and give them the cooling treatment, and the other half we would just give the standard intensive care, and then we were going to follow them up all the way for 18 months to see whether or not they survived and whether they had evidence of cerebral palsy and brain damage. And in order to do that, we had to have, I think, about 25 hospitals around the world all collaborating. And because the other thing that we knew is that we had to start the cooling treatment as soon as possible after birth. The longer every hour that went by before you started the cooling, you basically missed the boat. And so it was an extraordinary logistical business. In fact, I can remember at the time there was a baby born with had difficulties in a hospital in North London, and I can remember going in the back of the ambulance with the blue lights flashing to try and get to this baby fast enough and get the baby back to UCH in the centre so that we could get the schooling started before 6 hours. So it was we were all watching the clock. And anyway, to cut a very long story short, this trial, to my utter amazement, showed that it worked, and that the babies who had the cooling, there was significantly less death and significantly less cerebral palsy and brain damage. And so we wrote that up. There were other trials that looked at the same thing. And now it's become standard treatment around the world that babies who have this problem should receive cooling treatment. So it was utterly extraordinary to see it go from this mad idea with everybody shaking their head and saying, "You've got to be joking," to now it's standard treatment.
Goodness me, that must fill you with a real sense of achievement and pride to have been part of that.
Yes, it does. But, as a Christian, when I look back, and I just say, actually, it wasn't because, we were much more better trained or more clever or more creative than anybody else. It did feel, it was almost like it was something that God had just been there and
divinely inspired.
Yes, it just seemed extraordinary. A sort of a whole serendipity, a whole lot of chance coincidences. I remember chance conversation with somebody else. I happened to say, "Oh, I'm quite interested in cooling." And she was a doctor from another specialist from another country, from Norway. And she said, "Oh, you're interested in cooling. I'm interested in cooling. Why don't we collaborate?" And so, that was things like that. So, yeah, it was an extraordinary time, but just a sense again that God was in this in some way, and it is a wonderful adventure. But I have to say there was a huge amount of stress at the time, and we genuinely didn't know whether it was going to work. And one of my nightmares was that actually it would turn out that the babies who got cooled had more problems and more brain damage and more death than the ones who hadn't, in which case, I also knew there was quite a lot of interest from the media and so on. And I used to lie in bed and imagine these banner headlines that said something like "Babies die in failed hospital experiments," and senior investigator suspended, inquiries being carried out. So one of the sad things about the way that the media works is you're either a hero, because you're saving lives, or else you're this terrible, evil person who's doing terrible things to babies. And it's like you can't be somewhere between those two.
Yes, and it's a lot of pressure on your shoulders. Well, talking of pressure, that brings me to my next question about what the NHS is going through at the moment. So, we know that it's under huge pressure. COVID has been a massive strain. It's unlike anything we've ever experienced before. What are you hearing from the doctors in your networks, John, about the sorts of challenges?
Yes, well, it has been an extraordinary experience because when the first lockdown happened, and I remember vividly those times when we were all wondering what on earth is going to happen. And because of my links with many doctors and through the Christian Medical Fellowship and other links, I was aware of quite a lot of young medical students and junior doctors who were suddenly being pitchforked into the most astonishing situations. And a lot of final year medical students who were anticipating that they got another year of working on the wards and then taking their final exams, they suddenly got a letter saying, "You are now a qualified doctor and you report for duty on the intensive care unit on Monday." And they were suddenly pitchforked into this extraordinary situation and many of them really struggled because they were completely unprepared for the kind of responsibilities they were carrying, and in particular the emotional problems, because of course they were often there with the full PPE, watching people die in the intensive care unit, trying to communicate with loved ones who couldn't even visit, and having conversations by telephone and so on, and somehow trying to do the right thing. So there were enormous psychological pressures, particularly on the junior doctors and nursing staff and so on. And I think what's happened now is that it's gone from the acute crisis into a sort of very long-term, just continual pressure, and there's a lot of burnout, a lot of people struggling with stress and depression, anxiety. It really is taking its toll on many of the hospital staff, seniors as well as juniors. And one of the things that makes it so hard, and particularly again at certain phases when there's been a lot of media publicity saying, oh, it's just a scam and it's not true, and the hospitals are actually empty and all this is being invented, and there were people going to the hospitals and taking photographs of empty corridors and saying, look, we show you. So when you're absolutely under terrible pressure and watching people die in the ITU, and then you come out and you read this stuff, it's really quite hard to take psychologically, and very frustrating when you see so much misinformation and just frank lies being told about what the actual situation is.
Yes, I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And I mean, I'm amazed to see during this pandemic the amount of misinformation and the amount of people who believe it, people that you think of as being relatively sensible, people in your own family, you think, come on, like go to the source, go to the reliable media sources. Because, you talk about the media there, John, but obviously that's for the most part not mainstream media.
Yes, and so one of the fascinating and really troubling things about this pandemic is that it's like there have been two related pandemics. At one level, there's a physical virus which has been multiplying and replicating and spreading and mutating and spreading across from bodies around the world. But at the same time, there's what some people have called an infodemic, a pandemic of misinformation. And interestingly, that also is doing the same thing. It's starting and multiplying and spreading and mutating and appearing. And I think it's turning out that actually, paradoxically, it's easier to control and deal with the physical virus than it is to deal with the misinformation. And there seem to be many people who are so vulnerable to misinformation and so suspicious of official channels, including doctors, scientists, official news media, and all the rest. They much prefer to believe some scurrilous disinformation which is being circulating around on social media. And I do find that very, very troubling, because if we cannot agree what is true, then it's almost like the very foundations of our democracy start to crumble. And I think trying to educate people about the nature of science, about the nature of how the scientific process works, and it is very hard to understand because the amount of scientific openness that there's been during the pandemic has been completely unique. I mean, it's been so much better than anything that's happened before. What happened is that very rapidly the doctors and scientists working in the area realized that this was what's often called an existential threat. This was something that was potentially going to devastate and cause millions of deaths around the world, as indeed it has done. But as a result, they all started collaborating together. So the sworn enemies and competitors of different research groups and different commercial organizations all agreed to collaborate and share their information and to make it available on open access. So all the information has been available on open access, and there have been hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers just constantly coming out. And, as science works, something comes out and then someone says, hang on a minute, I found something different. And then we say, well, there's another one. But the scientific openness and the scientific collaboration has been extraordinary. So then it becomes so hard to understand that with that level of openness and that there's the large numbers of scientists around the world who are all participating in it, it's hard to understand why such levels of suspicion are there, particularly as it's often the same people who are making a fuss because I can't have the latest treatment for cancer, and I insist on, why isn't the NHS providing this latest drug which has been shown to extend life in cancer or some particular forms of cancer. And yet there's kind of double think, because it's exactly the same doctors and exactly the same clinical trials which have been showing these treatments which have been so effective for cancer. And yet it's like we can trust doctors when they're talking about cancer, but we absolutely can't trust them when those same doctors are now saying there's a virus which needs to be and that we've now got a vaccine which actually works and which helps. And it's that kind of very strange doublethink, which is hard to understand.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like when the anti-vaxxers end up in hospital, and then they're saying, I just so wish I'd had the vaccine, and then by that point it's too late. We were hearing quite a few of those stories, weren't we? In the recent months, very sad stories of people who shunned the vaccine because they believed these things that they were reading, and then it was too late for them because they caught the virus and they fell very unwell.
Yes, and there is something very unusual and interesting about the internet, and that is that it's been shown that stories which are fundamentally false spread much more rapidly and much more quickly than stories that are true. And there's some quite a lot of scientific evidence demonstrating that. And if you think about it, you can see why that happens. So a news story that says vaccines are working well and the number of complications is small, versus a news story that says shock horror, vaccines cause infertility or whatever, which is the story that people are going to click on and then
share.
spread and share and all the rest.
That's the key to it, isn't it? Sharing.
That it's and because the way the algorithms work is they're actually designed to spot what people are clicking on and then feed more of those stories. And so it does seem like the whole of this infrastructure of social media and the internet is almost calculated to spread disinformation and frankly just falsehoods and lies.
Well, that brings us quite nicely to talking a little bit about your book, John, and your research into artificial intelligence. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in how, as technology advances, it sort of raises a question again, what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to be human if we can keep you alive at 23 weeks of gestation? Or what does it mean to be human if you've got such severe brain damage that you're in a persistent vegetative state? And I see artificial intelligence as almost like the next big challenge, the next big question. What does it mean to be human if we can make a machine which seems to be as intelligent and as compassionate as a human being? And is there any difference between a human being and an intelligent computer? Are we just all computers made out of meat, as one roboticist used to say? So
They're pretty convincing in Blade Runner, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. Well, one of the fascinating things about all this is that science fiction writers have been writing about this theme for actually more than 100 years. I mean, it goes all the way back to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and H.G. Wells. And so there have been science fiction has raised all these kind of issues. And one of the things that I've sort of realized, and that is that most of the technologists who are leading, actually working on this, they're all science fiction nuts. They've all imbibed all the science fiction stories right from childhood. And now what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the science fiction come true. And there's many examples where actually the way that this technology has been developed has been precisely because of the science fiction. And I could give you a number of examples, but just one of them that comes to mind, and that is, do you know why Alexa, the Amazon Alexa, has a particular kind of voice? Do you know what that voice is modeled on?
No.
It's modeled on the computer in Star Trek.
Oh, really?
This calm female voice. So whenever everything is going wrong, that calm female voice is still in control. So Alexa has exactly that same voice. And that's just one example about how the technologists are trying to make the science fiction come true. Something which is quite scary is that there are science fiction novels by Ian Banks, well-known science fiction writer who's now sadly passed away. But he came up with the idea of what he called neural lace, which was wiring which was fitted underneath the skull, which would allow you to then be connected to computers. And so he wrote about this neural lace. And lo and behold, Elon Musk, having read this, says, I'm going to make this come true. And I've got billions of dollars and I'm going to invest in it. And so it is interesting how
it is very interesting, isn't it? I've actually just finished reading Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. I don't know if you've read that one, but that was fascinating, and that's got a lot of Christian kind of imagery around Adam and Eve and building a paradise, but it's also very, very dark, dystopian kind of vision of the future. So yes, it is all a little bit frightening when you start to sort of take these things to their logical conclusions, and you start to see the ethical implications of them. And I think that's really where what you're doing, John, is quite unique and really helpful, because I don't think that many people are looking at the ethical implications of some of these technologies.
Well, certainly not within the Christian world. There are quite a lot of people in the secular world who are increasingly engaging with this and setting up think tanks and so on. But I've found it quite frustrating in trying to persuade some Christian theologians and scholars, that this is an important point. Actually, it was quite difficult. I mean, interestingly, I think most people who become theologians or church leaders, they didn't study science. They gave it all up fairly young. They studied humanities. They're not interested in science. They don't read science fiction. So they just find the whole thing, it's just all rubbish. I'm not interested. Which I think is a mistake, because actually I do think that there is a real threat. And paradoxically, I'm less worried about sort of lethal autonomous weapons and so-called killer robots, although that's real and is a threat. I find what's most scary are intelligent computers that can simulate compassion and all the most human characteristics of communication and empathy and emotional intelligence and so on, because the ability to simulate to such an extent that you can't tell the difference is something that I find very troubling. And it's happening. People are, for instance, there are programs and websites where you can feed in all the texts and emails that you've ever done in your life, and then after you die, you will carry on sending texts and emails, quotes. The program will, and people are saying, this is wonderful. It helps me to carry on a relationship with my close friend who died, and it's helping me in the grieving process. And you're thinking, what is going on here when you can simulate a human identity, a human person, and yet it's just clever programming.
Well, it's funny you talk about that, because we've literally just covered that issue in the February edition of Premier Christianity magazine. We've got a fascinating article on these AI bots that are providing. Well, it was specifically about someone who died, and they were this grieving boyfriend was able to continue the relationship with the girlfriend. It's fascinating stuff. I could talk to you for hours, John, but we are coming towards the end of the show. So can I just ask you in these last couple of minutes, can you just give us some pointers as to what we can be praying for in terms of the big kind of issues that are affecting Christian medics?
Yes, I think prayer is really important, and I think we can pray particularly for the next generation. I feel now my main responsibility is to try to encourage the next generation. I've just come back from a conference, the Christian Medical Fellowship, where there were, I think, nearly 400 Christian medical students, and they're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they're all wanting to serve God and so on. But and trying to, I think, pray for these people who are going on to medicine. They are the ones who are going to face many of these new ethical challenges, and we need the next generation of people, both medics and nurses and technologists, scientists, who will really engage and practice this double listening, with a desire both to be faithful to God and to the Christian faith, and at the same time really engage and be relevant with the big challenges that are coming up. And I'm not pessimistic. I think so often what we find is that it's precisely when those big challenges come that we see the power and the truth of Christianity. And I think pray that God would raise up more people who will really see this as important and want to engage in it in the name of Christ.
Well, John, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your experiences and insight.
No, thank you. It's been great to have the conversation.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this interview. For hundreds more conversations just like it, you can download the profile as a podcast. Just search for the profile wherever you usually get your podcasts, or visit premierchristianradio.com/the profile.
You've been listening to The Profile in association with Premier Christianity magazine.